is our king? Who will pull the sword from the stone? Myths and legends tell of great men with sacred blood, hearts of purest gold, anointed by the gods themselves. Now we have only distant memories of them, etched into ancient stones. And now, mortal men, with their leaden souls, are not worthy to don the crown of regal splendor. Though the kings of old may be lost to time, perhaps there will come another in the endless recurring cycle to bring us into a new age of light. Where is our king?
The idea of the king has long captured the imaginations of people throughout the ages, with many stories, myths, and legends told about these imposing and sometimes superhuman figures. It can be hard for the modern mind, which has been so indoctrinated with beliefs about the superiority of democracy, to understand the fascination that the institution of the monarchy inspired throughout the ages. We live in an age where the common man is championed, and so we have come to believe, often unquestioningly, in the virtues of government ruled by the people, where the power to govern is conferred upon the ruler by the ruled, and the elected man must forever be subjected to the ever-changing whims of the masses, bowing to their decrees in order to maintain his position of limited power. In the world of tradition, the people answered to the king, and the king answered to God. Our modern democracies are an inversion and perversion of this traditional system of government. An inversion because it places those who naturally should reside at the bottom of the hierarchy at the top, and a perversion because it has removed God and morality from the equation altogether. We modern people have constructed governments around our own hubris, and then wonder why our societies are fractured, violent, and disorganized. And so, once again, we look to the world of tradition for guidance. Evola argues that kingship is the supreme form of government, and he begins this chapter on regality by discussing the pontifex, a word that means builder of bridges. But these are not physical bridges. The role of the pontifex is to be the bridge between the inferior physical realm and the superior metaphysical realm, the bridge between the common people and God. This is the proper and most fundamental role of the king, to be the living embodiment of divine principle, and in fact, he could be thought of as a manifestation of God. Traditionally, the king would have been the leader of the priestly caste, The foundation of authority for the traditional king stemmed from his transcendent quality. This was a very real, powerful attribute that all around him would have felt in his personal gravitas, and it was a quality he had due to being a deeply spiritually evolved person. Evola writes, "Traditional civilizations, unlike those of decadent and later times, completely ignored the merely political dimension of supreme authority, as well as the idea that the roots of authority lay in mere strength, violence, or natural and secular qualities such as intelligence, wisdom, physical courage, and a minute concern for the collective material well-being. The roots of authority, on the contrary, always had a metaphysical character. Likewise, the idea that the power to govern is conferred on the chief by those whom he rules, and that his authority is the expression of the community and therefore subject to its decrees, was foreign to tradition. Unlike the modern idea that statesmen should be accountable to their electorate, the traditional view is that the king is accountable to God and the natural order. What Evola is referring to is the concept of the divine right of kings, a heavenly mandate to rule, or in some cases, even a God made flesh. Looking back at the ancient lists of kings and dynasties, we find they often trace back to a deity as the founder of that lineage. We also find that, the further back in time we go, kings are often listed as having ruled for exceptionally long periods of time, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years. When we consider how prehistoric man may have experienced time differently due to his stronger metaphysical connection, then we can understand how they might have come to interpret a king as having ruled for millennia. We can also speculate that perhaps there is some truth to the claims of kings being descended from gods, from a time when we were less animal and more divine. The concept of the divine right of kings eventually fell out of favor in modern times and gave way to democracies. While kingship may be the ideal form of government in a golden age, in the dark age of the Kali Yuga, we instead find kings who rule as Machiavellian princes. The peasants revolted against such kings, as they had lost their inner divine principle. Modern kingship reflected only a distant memory of what true kings used to be, and they were often no longer respected leaders who could provide a spiritual orientation for their people and lead them to God, but were instead corrupt and power-hungry, exploiting their citizens and leading their nations deeper into the inferior materialistic realm and further away from the divine. In the Golden Age, the traditional king was not a servant of the mob in the way that modern politicians are, but instead was meant to know the best way to lead his people to the transcendent because he himself was a living embodiment of it. Thus, it would make sense in the Golden Age to remove all obstacles to the sovereign reign of such a king and ensure that he had total power, as his guidance would always be what was best for his people and his kingdom. However, kingship in the fallen age of man is problematic because the office has become so corrupted. In the dark age of modernity, we require as many divisions and impediments to power as possible, as it slows down the progress of evil, whereas such divisions of power would only hinder the achievement of good in an era of sight and vision. Evola refers to kingship as being associated with solar symbolism, and he references numerous solar cults that were related to kingship. The sun bestows light and life upon the world, and there is a near-universal connection between the illumination of the sun and that of the enlightenment of the mind. The sun is a symbol of a superior nature, of conquering one's inferior nature or darkness, in the same way that the physical sun overcomes darkness when it rises each morning. So too was the king a man who had overcome his darkness, his inferior human nature, and was thus situated in his being. always connected to the divine realm by virtue of having liberated himself from the cravings and aversions found in the common, undeveloped man. The king was the source of his own light, just like the sun. He had no need for seeking anything outside of himself. His ego did not need the love and reverence of his people, so as a consequence of this self-sufficiency, he was wholeheartedly loved and revered. This solar nature of the king not only illuminated his inner being, but the outer world as well. Much like the sun can be seen as an unblinking, all-seeing eye, which traverses both the upper and lower worlds on its daily rounds, the king too kept a watchful eye for any darkness in his kingdom. An unwavering guarantor of justice, his solar wisdom would be brought to bear on any corrections needed to bring his people and nation in line with the will of God. A solar kind of glory and victory were also related to kingship, not merely as a symbol, but in fact as a metaphysical reality. The glory the king possessed is referred to as a kind of heavenly fire that burns within him and leads him to victory. This divine fire is the very essence of kingship. Victory here is referred to in a twofold sense, with both an exoteric and esoteric meaning. On the exoteric level, it is military or material victory, and on the esoteric level, it is a mystical victory, a spiritual victory, the conquering of the darkness. These two things were inextricably linked, as a king could not expect to have achieved victory in the external world without first having achieved it internally. The ultimate victory would be to achieve a society in which every individual is living in a state of high vibration, full of virtue and in frequent contact with transcendent being. And so here we see again the king's function as pontifex, the builder of bridges. One cannot teach others what one has not mastered themselves. And so the king, having achieved transcendence himself, becomes a living example for others to follow and establishes a spiritual force that is the basis of his authority, rather than through cleverness and charisma, military might, or political maneuvering. In the Golden Age, in the world of tradition, mere physical force is nothing compared to spiritual might. A king embodying such transcendent power cannot be harmed by any material force. Physical threats cease when one has spiritual authority, because spiritual authority has primacy over physical force. The violent conception of might makes right is a dark age logic of today, but this is superseded in the Golden Age. As such, might still makes right, but only in the sense of spiritual might. This is why the ultimate king is of the priestly caste and not the warrior caste. If he lives imbued with the transcendent, he will reign so supreme in his spiritual authority that none will wish to have conflict with him. When this spiritual force is unleashed, common men bend under it as though they are blades of grass in the wind. By being established in his spiritual force, the king fulfilled his role as a vector between the heavens and the earth. This was dependent on the king maintaining his inner triumphal way of being. The divine energy channeled by the king did not belong to him permanently, but was merely lent to him so long as he maintained the required metaphysical energy. By maintaining roots in something that was more than life, something transcendent and divine, the king had the power to perform ritual and sacrificial actions, and could actualize the power of such rites. His ability to do this was connected with his right to kingship, and a nation's fortunes or misfortunes, as well as the moral quality of his subjects, was assumed to be dependent on his behavior. Evola says this later degenerated into superstitious beliefs about catastrophes, indicating the king had committed some misdeed or sin, rather than simply being the absence of metaphysical power. An example of this concept in the ancient world can be found in the Egyptian pharaohs who claimed descent from the gods, typically one of the solar gods such as Horus or Ra, and whose principal role as king was seen as being the upholder of Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of the divine cosmic order, and his personal adherence to Ma'at furnished an implicit moral code. Failure to provide such moral leadership was seen to undermine the stability of the kingdom as well as the pharaoh's legitimacy. Evola leads us into the end of the chapter by discussing a number of mythological tales in regards to acquiring kingship. As we mentioned previously, the divine power of the king was only lent to him so long as he retained the symbolic and solar dignity of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as well as maintaining his inner equilibrium and being. If he failed to do this, the force would be transferred to someone more worthy of it. Earlier in the chapter, Evola makes a passing reference to a metaphysical fluid, the power of which consecrates and gives witness to the solar triumphant nature of the king and gushes forth from one king to the other, thus guaranteeing the uninterrupted and golden sequence in the divine lineage. One of the tales he references is that of the Rex Nemorensis, or Nemi's king of the woods. This ancient tale has corollaries all over the world. The story of the Rex Nemorensis is one whose priestly and royal office is conferred to the person who can take the king by surprise and kill him, and interestingly, only a runaway slave armed with a branch torn from the sacred oak is eligible for the office. The symbolic meaning of the story provides a glimpse into the metaphysical world of tradition. One might wonder, why a runaway slave? The esoteric meaning of this figure is one who has escaped from his masters, that is, a person who has freed himself from the bonds of his lower nature, who is no longer enslaved by his human passions, his cravings, or his aversions, and he is armed with a branch from the sacred oak, which Evola interprets in two ways. Firstly, it represents the world tree, a concept found in many cultures throughout history, and such a tree is a symbol of primordial life force. So the aspirant must first acquire a piece of this heavenly tree before he can be eligible to fight for kingship, which means he must be in touch with the transcendent to acquire a piece of that divinity. Another way the tree symbolizes this connection to imperial ideals is the dry tree, essentially a dead, leafless tree, which was found throughout medieval literature and art to represent life without God or moral death, and one upon which dying kings would hang their swords and shields, perhaps returning their kingly force to the divine. A modern representation of such a tree is the white tree of Gondor in The Lord of the Rings. The health of the white tree is closely connected with the health of Gondor and its kings in general, and also represents the link between the men of Numenor, from whom the men of Gondor are descended, and the blessed realm of the Valar, a holy primordial race of beings who created the world. Aragorn's planting of a sapling of the white tree and its rapid blooming represented the return of glorious kingship to Gondor. The second meaning of the tree is a representation of the feminine. In ancient traditions, sacred trees are often symbolic of goddesses, and Evola points out a connection between traditional symbolic connections between goddesses, forces of life, immortality, wisdom, and trees. Another way of symbolically representing the acquisition of divine power is the king's seduction of or marriage to a goddess or demigoddess or some other kind of very exceptional woman, where she is often represented as a guardian of the fruits of immortality, a personification of supernatural forces, or as an embodiment of the principle of sovereignty. This is an apt representation of the metaphysical forces called Shiva and Shakti in Hinduism. Shakti is the representation of the divine feminine, raw, chaotic, dancing power. Shiva is a representation of the masculine principle, consciousness personified, of which kings are the embodiment. Kings are always male in the world of tradition, because the office is a manifestation of the masculine solar principle functioning in the material world. Speaking metaphysically, Lord Shiva, the masculine principle, has no power on his own, but when he masters himself and personifies an ideal, he draws power to him in the form of Shakti, who is irresistibly drawn to him. Shakti feels that, through Shiva's groundedness, his immutability, she has the full ability to express her power and to dance to her full extent. When Shiva imbues her with his rational aspect, it allows her power to become imbued with meaning. Thus, when the king is the perfect representation of the male archetype, she sees in him all the hopes and dreams of an entire kingdom, and through her the king can draw on endless reserves of metaphysical power. We can see a modern echo of this in the idea that a man is unelectable if he is not married. The modern person may not understand why they have this perception, but somewhere in the collective unconscious is the memory of our fundamental nature and how metaphysical reality demands we should be oriented. The ability to attract a woman is the proof of the man's ability and suitability for a leadership role, as it is an indication of his solar qualities. Thus, the ability of a mythical king to seduce a goddess indicates his superior solar nature. Another physical manifestation of a king's supernatural connection was his thaumaturgical virtue, that is, his ability to perform miracles, or what in Vedic tradition are called siddhis, powers that one acquires when they are deeply connected to the spiritual realm through initiation and self-mastery. Perhaps the most commonly known is the royal touch, also called the laying of hands, a power that could initially heal all diseases, but over the passage of time degraded to only being able to heal a few, and finally none at all. These powers were sometimes believed to be passed down to the next generation, or to even imbue the clothes that were worn by such men, which were treated as relics. The display of such powers offered eyewitness proof to the king's divinity or semi-divinity. Distant echoes of these prehistoric traditional beliefs about the nature of regality can still be seen in relatively recent times, but these modern monarchies merely imitate the past. They wear the royal dress, but lack the inner constitution. Just as it is in our nature to create order from chaos in the form of civilization, it is also in our nature to orient towards natural law, towards dharma. Hierarchy is dharma. It follows the natural order of the universe. We naturally seek to establish societies based on these principles, to seek leaders who can represent the best of our nations, an ideal form and expression, and to be the bridge through whom we can reach the sacred path. We yearn to live in harmony with the natural order, to be connected to the great source once again. We long for a leader who is the living embodiment of the Word, who holds the scepter of divine justice, who does not serve himself but serves God, and in turn the whole kingdom does the same. Around this wheel turns the fate of nations, and the path illuminated by the Solar King allows the common man to experience the transcendent. He is the Lord of Peace, the supreme guardian of earthly stability and strength, and a great bridge between worlds. When he holds firm the center of the wheel of Dharma, then society is imbued with grounding force. The cycles of history tell us that when the next golden age commences, it will mark the beginning of a new regal lineage, traced from the forthcoming King of Kings downward through the millennia into the unknown future, where it all decays and fades, then begins again infinitely. Although the leaders of today leave much to be desired, we can instead turn our hearts and minds towards the grand idea that the King represents, and we can make ourselves worthy of him in absentia, as we seek to raise ourselves out of the darkness of the modern age, in the belief that someday maybe there will appear the leader we need, the one who, imbued with the light, can act as a bridge for those who seek the way, one who brings stability and righteousness, one who is fit to lead because he is connected to the divine and ensures the earthly reign of Dharma through his voice, his law, and his will.
The avatar to dance again.